The candles in the great hall of Stanhope Park had been burning since 4 o'clock that afternoon, and by the time Cecily Vane arrived with her father's old document case under her arm, they had begun to gutter in the drafts that found their way through the stone corridors, casting the assembled faces in a light that seemed to waver between gold and shadow. It was the 23rd of November, 1817, and Aldous Crewe had turned 21 that morning. The Stanhope estate solicitors had requested a clerk to attend the evening's proceedings, and Mr. Hartwell, whose own hands had grown too unreliable for precise notation, had sent Cecily in his place. She had smoothed her gray wool gown before she left the lodging-house. She had tucked her hair to its tightest point and walked the quarter-mile in the cold because the occasion required her to be invisible. And she knew how to do that very well. The hall had been arranged for formality. A long table of dark walnut had been placed before the fireplace, and at it sat 3 men. Mr. Hartwell at one end, looking smaller than Cecily had ever seen him. A London solicitor named Pemberton, who represented the Crewe family's interests, and Marcus Lee, Viscount Ashmore, who sat at the table's center with the particular quality of stillness that Cecily had observed in him across 3 years of working in the estate's archive rooms. He did not move unnecessarily. He did not speak before he was ready. His eyes, when he entered a room, gathered at first and settled on its most significant point, and the significant point in any room that also contained him was him. Though she did not think he intended the effect. She took her chair at the corner of the table, behind the solicitors, and to the left, where a clerk sat. She opened her case. She arranged her papers. She was not introduced. Mrs. Dorothea Crewe stood near the fireplace with her son at her elbow. She was a woman of 50 who wore her confidence the way certain women wore jewels, not as ornament, but as declaration. She turned to say something low to Pemberton as Cecily was settling herself, and the words that came back were not directed at Cecily, but reached her clearly across the quiet room. "You will want to review the archive documents this evening," she said to Pemberton. "Hartwell has sent the clerk's daughter. She handles the copying work." Pemberton nodded without looking at Cecily. The clerk's daughter. The phrase landed and settled into the floor beneath Cecily's chair. She wrote the date at the top of her page, and the time, and the names of those present, and her pen did not hesitate. Lord Ashmore, across the table, said nothing. His eyes moved, briefly, in her direction. What followed was the careful, procedural language of legal dispute conducted in drawing rooms rather than courts, the kind of dispute that had been developing for 19 years and had now arrived, by the simple mechanism of a birth date and a calendar, at the moment it could no longer be deferred. He had come of age. The petition his mother had been preparing across the better part of 2 decades could now be filed in his name and under his seal. He was, Mrs. Crewe's solicitor asserted, the rightful Earl of Stanhope, the lawful son of the previous Lord Stanhope's prior and legal first marriage, conducted in Virginia in the year 1793, before the union that had produced the Viscount Ashmore. Cecily kept writing. Her hand was steady. The room was not. The question of the first marriage and whether it was lawful, whether it had been dissolved, whether the records of it were legitimate or fabricated, had been the legal shadow over Stanhope Park since the previous Lord Stanhope's death 3 years prior. Marcus had been managing the estate in the interim, in legal limbo, as the matter worked its way through the slow machinery of probate and petition. He had done so without visible distress. Cecily had observed this from the archive rooms where she spent her working days, watching him pass the corridor outside, hearing him speak with Hartwell in measured sentences about inheritance and documentation and the patience required of a man in his position. She had thought, on more than one occasion, that the patience cost him something the composure did not show. She set her pen down when the proceedings ended, at 8:45, and began to pack her case. The fire had been built up. The candles on the near side of the table had been replaced. Lord Ashmore stood at the far end of the room with Hartwell, speaking quietly, and Cecily did not look at him because it was not her place to look, and she had grown expert at occupying the space that was her place and no more. She let herself out through the side passage. She walked the 1/4 mile back to the lodging house in the cold. She did not think about the folded document inside the lining of her document case, hidden where only she would know to look. She had put it there 3 nights before. She had taken it from the estate archive and replaced it with the original, which she had found misfiled in a secondary registry ledger so far from where anyone would look that she had nearly passed it herself. She did not think about what she had done. She thought about whether she had noted all the correct names in the evening's record. Her father, Mr. Thomas Vane, had been the Stanhope estate solicitor for 22 years before his death, and it was in his service, and then in Mr. Hartwell's after him, that Cecily had learned the archive rooms at Stanhope Park the way other young women learned the rooms of their own homes. She knew which ledgers dated to the previous century and which had been begun by her father in his first year of service. She knew where the water from the north-facing window had stained the binding of the registration volumes in the second shelving bay. She knew the handwriting of every clerk who had notated the estate records across the last 40 years, because she had spent the last 2 of her own years copying documents for preservation, and she had read more of those records than anyone living. It was the handwriting that had told her, on the night 3 weeks before the formal petition could be filed, that something was wrong. She had been working late, as she often did, by candlelight in the archive's inner room. She was reviewing the primary registration volumes as part of the routine audit Hartwell had requested in advance of the Crewe petition, and she had turned to the page in question and looked at it, and known. The page recorded the absence of a certain marriage registration, citing its non-existence as confirmation of the prior marriage's primacy. It was a document that had not been in the archive 6 weeks prior, when she had last reviewed the same volume for a different audit. The ink was slightly too uniform. The formation of the ampersands was wrong, a small thing, one a court might not notice, but she noticed because she had been reading the hands of archive clerks for 2 years, and because her father had taught her, before all else, to look at what was actually on the page, rather than what she expected to find there. She had pulled the secondary registry ledger from the 3rd shelf of the far bay. It had taken her 4 hours. At 3:15 in the morning, she had found the original registration, misfiled in a bundle dated to the wrong year, folded and pressed between 2 documents that had no bearing on it, as if set aside by a hand that was not sure where to put it and had chosen somewhere unlikely. The date on the original was correct. The officiant's signature was correct. The handwriting was consistent with the known records of the parish register for that year and county. Lord Stanhope's first marriage had been to Lady Margaret Ashmore, his mother, in the spring of 1784. It had been properly registered. There was no prior marriage. Cecily had sat with this knowledge for a long time. She had thought about what she should do. She had considered going to Hartwell, who was elderly and frightened, and who had, she suspected, already seen what she was seeing, and had chosen not to act. She had considered going to Lord Ashmore directly, which was not a thing she had any right to do, and which was not within the boundary of her station or her employment. She was the clerk's daughter. She handled the copying work. She had removed the forged document and placed the original back in its correct position in the primary registration volume. She had taken the forgery home and hidden it inside the lining of her document case. She had gone to sleep at 5 o'clock in the morning and risen again at 7 and returned to the archive as if nothing had changed, because nothing had changed for anyone else. What she had done was, she was aware, criminal in the most technical sense, and courageous in no sense she could safely claim. She had replaced a forgery with a truth. She had done it because she could not leave the page as it stood, and because her father had spent 22 years in the service of an estate whose record she knew better than any person alive, and because she had looked at that forged document and felt a clear, cold certainty that was not sentiment, but precision. She had done it for the archive. She told herself this, mostly. On the 4th night after Aldous came of age, Lord Ashmore found her working late. She had not heard him come into the outer room. The archive at Stanhope Park was accessible from the main house through a corridor off the library, and the library door was left unlocked during the period of the proceedings so that the solicitors could retrieve documents when needed. She had come after supper to finish a copying task that had been interrupted by the evening's proceedings, and she was deep in it, her head bent over the page, when she became aware of a stillness in the doorway to the inner room that was not the stillness of a room at rest, but the stillness of a person standing and watching. She looked up. He stood at the threshold. He was still in his evening coat, but his cravat had been loosened, and he had a glass of something in his right hand that he was not drinking. He said nothing when she looked up at him. He looked at the document she was copying. He looked at her hand, which held the pen at the precise angle she had been trained to use for preservation copies. He looked at her face. "Miss Vane," he said. "My lord," she said. He came into the room not far, only a few steps, but enough that he could see over her shoulder to the document she was working on. It was a property survey from 1801. It had nothing to do with the proceedings. He stood close enough that she could feel the slight warmth of him in the cold room. "You are not required to work tonight," he said. "The survey needs finishing before Mr. Hartwell submits his supplementary brief," she said. "Tomorrow would serve." "Yes," she said. "But I am here now." He stood there for a moment without speaking. She kept her eyes on the page. She was aware of exactly where he was in the room, the way she was always aware of the room's significant point when he was in it. And she was aware that her awareness was a liability she could not afford, and which she would not look at directly. He moved away from her, toward the shelving bays, and she heard him stop in front of the second bay, where the primary registration volumes sat. She did not look up. She heard him draw out one of the volumes and open it. She heard him turn pages. She heard him stop. "This was audited recently," he said. "Yes," she said, "as part of Mr. Hartwell's preliminary review. The pages are in good order." "They are." A long pause. "My father's marriage registration," he said. His voice was even. "It is in the primary volume." "It is, my lord." He replaced the volume. He left the room without speaking again. She kept her pen moving. She did not tremble until she heard the library door close. She returned the next morning to find a small bowl of dried lavender placed on the corner of her working table. It had not been there before. There was no note. It was the sort of thing a housekeeper might place, and there was no reason at all to think it had any other origin, and she did not permit herself to think otherwise. She breathed in the dried scent of it, and then looked away. And she worked until 4 o'clock. And she thought about lavender, and what it meant and what it did not mean, with the steady, determined discipline of a woman who had learned to think about documents rather than the hands that had placed them. She went home. She did not look at the document case in the corner of her room, though she was aware of it the way she had been aware of him standing in the doorway. In the days that followed, she saw him at intervals across the estate. He was always in motion. He was reviewing the account books with the steward in the morning room, or walking the grounds in the early winter light in his dark overcoat, or passing through the corridor outside the archive with another of the solicitors Pemberton had sent ahead of the hearing. He did not come to the archive room again. She told herself this was unsurprising. She told herself she had not been listening for his step in the outer room. She noticed, on the third morning, that the lavender bowl had been refilled. The dried flowers were from a different cut, slightly darker, still fragrant. She stood over it for a moment and did not move. There was a quality of still attention rising in her chest that she recognized from the archive, the sensation of knowing something before she had fully named it. The page not yet turned. If any part of you has ever waited for a thing and been afraid of what finding it would require of you, you know the room she spent those 10 days inhabiting. The story that follows is the story of what she decided to do anyway. She kept working. She always kept working. It was, as her father had told her, the most honest thing a person could do with time they could not otherwise fill. The formal hearing was set for the 12th of December, 3 weeks from young Aldous' birthday, and in the interval the estate filled with the particular atmosphere of a house that does not know yet which way the wind will settle it. Pemberton came and went with sheaves of papers. Hartwell moved through the archive rooms with a slowness that Cecily recognized as dread. 2 men from the Crewe household arrived to take their own inventory of the relevant volumes, and Cecily was present during this process, at Mr. Hartwell's direction, as a witness to the condition of the documents and nothing more. It was during this inventory that Aldous Crewe himself came into the archive room, his mother at his heels, and Pemberton just behind. He was a tall young man with his mother's confidence and the slightly glassy ease of someone who had been told his whole life that he was the rightful something. He looked around the room with the assessing eye of a person about to own it. His gaze landed on Cecily and registered nothing of significance. "The archive clerks," he said to his mother, not to Cecily. Then his gaze settled on Cecily's face with the mild incuriosity of a man cataloging furniture. "The clerk's daughter, is it?" She would not have been involved in the original filing. "No," Mrs. Crewe confirmed. He moved past Cecily towards the shelving bays. She stepped aside for him. She was not asked to speak. She kept her pen on the paper she had been making notes on, and she kept her hand level, and she noted the time of their entry in the corner of her page. The clerk's daughter. She had heard the phrase so many times across the last 2 years that she had ceased to feel it land as anything other than accurate description. Her father had been the clerk. She was his daughter. The phrase told the room what she was for and what she was not for. And the room had accepted this accounting without examination, and she had accepted it too, because she had not known until the night of the forgery that she had anything to offer that could not be described inside those 2 words. She watched Aldous run his finger along the spines of the primary registration volumes and felt nothing for him particularly. No special contempt, no personal animosity. He had been trained to believe in his claim. His mother had been meticulous in the training. That was its own kind of sorrow, she supposed, to come of age inside a story someone else had built for you, and to have no particular tools for understanding what the story had cost. What she felt, standing at the back of the archive room that her father had maintained for 22 years, was something she had not expected. She felt certain. Not hopeful. Not afraid. Certain. The way you were certain about handwriting you had read 100 times. The records were correct. She had made them correct. Whatever Pemberton found today, he would not find what he was looking for. And what he was looking for did not exist. And she was the only person in the room who knew this, with the full weight of a 4-hour night's work behind it. She noted the time of their exit in the same corner of the page, and said nothing aloud. It was that afternoon, when the Crewe household's men had gone and Hartwell had retired to his office for a 1/4 hour, that Cecily heard footsteps she recognized in the outer room. She did not go out to him. He came to the threshold of the inner room, and she looked up. And he looked at her. And there was something different in his face from the careful absence of expression she had seen there before. "Miss Vane," he said. "May I ask you something?" "Of course, my lord." He came in. He sat, without being invited to sit, in the chair across her work table from her. This was not a thing he had done before. He looked at his hands. Then he looked at her. "The archive was reviewed 4 weeks ago," he said. "By you and by Hartwell. The primary registration volumes were both documented as complete and in order." "Yes," she said. "Pemberton's man has today noted a discrepancy in the secondary registry. He is claiming a page has been removed from the secondary volume, and that the page's content suggested the primary registration was a later insertion." Cecily kept her face still. "That is what he is claiming," she said. "Is there anything you can tell me about the condition of those volumes?" She looked at him. She wanted to look at him directly, and she did. Though it was not the sort of thing she permitted herself for long. He was 31 years old and had been managing the estate under legal shadow for 3 years, and the line of his jaw was very controlled. And she thought that beneath the control, there was something that had been careful for a very long time. "The volumes are in the condition they were in when my father last catalogued them," she said. He held her gaze. He did not press further. A long pause extended between them. "My mother," he said finally, "was a careful woman." He said it as if he was telling her something about a technical matter rather than a grief. "She was careful about documentation because my father was not always so. She kept her own copy of certain registrations. I have not looked at it." "Why not?" Cecily asked. She had not intended to ask it. It was not within her place to ask. "Because if I look at it," he said, "and it confirms what the primary record says, I will have to believe that what the primary record says is true. And if I look at it and it does not match, I will have to believe that someone has tampered with one of the two." His hand moved, just slightly, to his breast pocket, where the outline of a small case was faintly visible against the wool. "I have not decided which I am prepared to know." She understood. The wound was not legal. It was filial, the wound of a boy who had loved his mother and had been asked, from the age of 12 forward, to hold her in a state of doubt. He could not look at her face in the miniature and trust it, because trusting it required believing she had been wronged, and believing she had been wronged required anger. And he had apparently decided, across 19 years, that he could not afford anger. "My lord," Cecily said. He looked at her. "The primary registration is correct," she said. "I would stake my father's 22 years of service on it." He looked at her for a long time. She held the gaze. Her pulse was in her throat, not from fear, but from the nearness of him across the narrow table, the quality of his attention, which was the most complete attention she had ever been given by anyone, and which her wound told her to distrust, because it would not last, because it was professional and not personal, because she was the clerk's daughter, and what he was looking at was her credibility, and not her. She was wrong about that. She knew she was wrong in the moment she thought it. The way you knew a copied hand was not the original, even before you could name the specific anomaly. The quality of his attention had shifted somewhere between his hand, settling on the shelf near her shoulder, and the moment she had said her father's name. He was not looking at her the way he looked at the documents she produced for him. He was looking at her the way he had stood at the doorway of the archive room and looked at her working, as if the looking cost him something he was accustomed to not spending. His hand was still beside her on the shelf. She looked at it. The space between his hand and her arm was perhaps 2 inches. He did not close it. She did not close it. They remained in that careful distance, and she was aware of every centimeter of it, and of the candle between them casting its unsteady light, and of the particular quiet of the archive room at that hour, when no one else was in the house wing. "Thank you, Miss Vane," he said. He rose. He left. She sat in the empty room and pressed her palm flat on the table to steady it. The table was cold. She had not noticed until now how cold she was, how the warmth of his nearness had insulated her against the winter in the stones, and how the room felt emptier than its ordinary empty when the door had closed. The morning of the 12th arrived gray and cold, with frost on the study windows and a fire already burning in the great hall when Cecily arrived at 8 o'clock. The hearing was to begin at 10. She was there to manage documentation and to serve as attestation of the archive's condition, if required. At 9:30, Pemberton appeared in the archive room with his own clerk. He produced a document and read aloud from it, addressing Mr. Hartwell, who had been brought in on a wheeled chair and looked as if he wished he were elsewhere. The document, Pemberton stated, described an irregularity discovered in the primary registration volume, a page that bore the signs of recent reinsertion, inconsistent ink aging, and handwriting anomalies. It was Pemberton's position that this page had been added to the volume fraudulently, and that the original volume had not contained it. Cecily wrote all of this down. Then Pemberton turned to her. "It is my understanding," he said, "that only one person had access to this archive room in the period in question. Miss Vane?" "I am one of several people with access," she said. "Mr. Hartwell, myself, and the estate steward." "The estate steward has not been in the archive for 6 weeks, Pemberton said. "Mr. Hartwell has not physically managed the volumes in some time. That leaves you, Miss Vane." The room was quiet. Lord Ashmore was standing near the fireplace. He was not looking at her. "The page was reinserted," Cecily said. "That is accurate. The handwriting anomalies in the surrounding pages are also accurate. The handwriting anomalies belong to a document that was placed in the archive falsely, and that document has since been removed, which is why the page reads as inconsistent. The original registration was removed from the primary volume sometime before my father's death and misfiled in the secondary registry, where it has sat unread for 3 years. I found it there 4 weeks ago and restored it to its correct position." Silence. "You are admitting," Pemberton said carefully, "that you made an alteration to the archive." "I am admitting that I corrected one," she said. Mrs. Dorothea Crewe had been sitting near the window. She rose. The light from the frost-white window was behind her, and her expression was the expression of a woman who had prepared for 20 years and was not prepared to lose her preparation now. "This is what it comes to," she said. "A clerk's daughter playing at solicitor, making unilateral judgments about documents that are not hers to touch. She has no legal standing. She has no authority. Whatever she did in that archive room cannot be admitted as evidence of anything except her own interference." She looked at the assembled men. "This is a young woman who was given too much access to rooms above her station. Whatever conclusion she reached without the training to reach it correctly." Cecily did not look at him. She looked at Mrs. Crewe. "I reached it," she said, "because I have read every document in that archive, and I know the handwriting of every clerk who has contributed to it across the last 40 years, including the clerk whose handwriting appeared on the forged page and did not appear anywhere else in the archive because that clerk was not in your father's employ, Mr. Pemberton. He was in yours." The room absorbed this. He had not spoken. She waited 3 seconds. 5. She counted them against the silence of the room. She had, she realized, believed that he would speak. She had believed this without quite knowing she believed it. The way you trusted a ledger to add correctly, because it always had, and the discovery that it did not was less about the ledger and more about what the error revealed about your own assumptions. She had done this thing alone. She had expected, somewhere beneath the precision of her practical thinking, that she would not stand alone when it was over. She had been wrong about that, too. Cecily gathered her papers. She rose from her chair with the steadiness that had always been her best and least appreciated quality. She said to Mr. Hartwell, "You know what I found?" And Hartwell looked at his hands and did not answer, and she left the room. She walked to the lodging house. She sat at the table in the kitchen, where her sister Judith was mending something by the window. Judith looked up. She looked at Cecily's face. She did not ask questions. She put the kettle on. Cecily sat with both hands around the cup for a long time after it was poured, and she looked at the window above the hearth, which showed the iron-gray December sky, and she let herself understand the shape of what had happened. She had stood in that room and told the truth, and it had cost her the only protection available to her, which was the fiction that she was too small to threaten anyone. Mrs. Crewe had seen the threat and named it. Pemberton would act on it. She had made herself visible in the one way she could not afford, in a room where visibility required someone else to look. He had not looked. He had stood at the fireplace and not looked. She understood why. A man in legal proceedings with his inheritance in question could not take the word of a woman against a London solicitor without evidence. She understood it the way she understood the handwriting of clerks she had never met, accurately and without comfort. Understanding a thing did not make it easier to sit with. She had always known this. Her father had told her that too. Cecily opened her document case. She took out the folded forgery from its lining. She looked at it for a long time. Then she took a sheet of paper. She wrote a letter. She wrote it in the same clear, precise hand she had used for 22 years of copying other people's documents, the hand her father had taught her in the archive rooms when she was 8 years old, and he had set her down at the table and told her that a person who could read what was actually on a page, and not what they expected to find there, was worth more than a person who could only read what they already knew. She told him what she had found. She told him where she had found it. She told him what the forgery was, and who had made it, and how it could be verified by comparing the hand against Pemberton's own clerk's known correspondence, which she had copied on 3 separate occasions, and which would be a matter of minutes to confirm. She enclosed the forged document. She sent Judith with it to the house. The following morning she did not go to the archive. She sat in the kitchen and did not tell Judith what she was waiting for. And Judith, being 19 and sensible, did not ask. At 11 o'clock, a footman arrived at the door with a note from Mr. Hartwell that said she was requested at the estate for the continuation of the proceedings. She put on her gray wool gown. She tucked her hair to its tightest point. She picked up the document case, which was lighter now, and walked the quarter-mile in the cold. The great hall was more crowded than it had been. There were 2 additional men she did not know, senior men by their dress, one of whom bore the insignia of a barrister's chambers, and the other of whom she recognized as Sir Edward Fallow, a senior peer whose family had long held a professional connection to the Stanhope estate. Mrs. Crewe was at the window. Aldous was beside her. Pemberton was standing at the end of the table and looked as if he had not slept. Marcus Lee stood at the center of the table. He had the forged document in his hand. This document, he said, was obtained from Miss Cecily Vane, who removed it from the estate archive on the 23rd of November, having recognized it as a forgery placed to interfere with the legitimacy of the primary registration. The primary registration is documented, authenticated, and consistent with the parish records of the relevant county. The forged document bears the handwriting of a clerk whose known correspondence has now been compared against it by Sir Edward's secretary and confirmed as matching. Pemberton said something low and technical. "Pemberton," Marcus said, and his voice was not raised, did not need to be. "My mother's marriage was lawful. Your client has known this for some time. Your own clerk will be interviewed this afternoon about his role in the forgery." Mrs. Crewe said, "This is the word of a clerk's daughter against the sworn position of a London solicitor. She has no standing." "She found the truth," Marcus said, "when every other hand had buried it." The room was very quiet. He looked at Cecily. She had not expected to be looked at. She had stood near the door, in her usual position, her document case closed, her pen uncapped but resting. She was not sure what her face was doing. She was sure it was doing something her discipline would not ordinarily have permitted, because what Lord Ashmore was doing was looking at her in front of Sir Edward Fallow and both solicitors and the entirety of the assembled proceedings, and he was not looking at her the way a man looks at a useful clerk. Mrs. Crewe sat down. Aldous said nothing. He was 21 years old, and he had come of age the wrong way, and there was nothing for him to do now but listen to Sir Edward Fallow explain to him the legal position in which he found himself, and the manner in which the petition would need to be withdrawn. Mr. Hartwell signed the attestation of the archive's condition with his unreliable hands and did not look up when he was done. It took until mid-afternoon for the procedural elements to close. The fire in the Great Hall had been banked and rebuilt twice before Pemberton and the Crews departed, and by the time the last carriage left the drive, the light outside was already thinning toward the early dark of December. Cecily was in the archive room when he found her. She was not working. She was standing in front of the second shelving bay, looking at the primary registration volume, which was back in its correct place, undisturbed. She had not intended to stand there. She had come in to collect her things, and found herself standing, and then standing longer than she had meant to. She heard him at the threshold. She did not turn around. "Miss Vane," he said. "My lord." He came into the room. He stood not behind her, but beside her, so that they were both looking at the shelving bay, the rows of volumes, the spines in their careful order. The candle on the work table was the only light. Outside, the wind had come up, and she could hear it against the window. "You should have told me," he said. "You might have felt obligated to report it," she said. "To Hartwell or to Pemberton, before it could be confirmed. That is a very careful reasoning." "I am a careful person." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him looking at her profile, though she was not looking at him. "You were not afraid," he said. It was not entirely a question. "I was afraid," she said. "I was afraid every night for 3 weeks. I am afraid now. A little." She paused. "I was more afraid of leaving it wrong." He turned toward her. She turned toward him because there was nowhere else reasonable to look. He was close. The archive room was small, and they were both at the shelving bay, which left less space between them than was strictly proper. And she was aware of this, and of the candle, and of the fact that she had been aware of where he was in every room he had ever been in, that she had also occupied, and she was tired of pretending that this was a professional habit, rather than what it was. "Your father," he said, "was the best solicitor this estate has had." "He would be glad to hear you say so," she said. "I am saying it to you." She looked at his face, which was very controlled, and at his eyes, which were not. He lifted his hand and set it against the shelf beside her, not touching her, but close, the warmth of it present in the small space between his hand and her shoulder. "I am going to ask you something," he said. "That is not about the archive." Her pulse was very clear in her throat. "You may," she said. He said her name. Not Miss Vane, but Cecily, her given name in his voice for the first time, deliberate as a signature. "Would you permit me to call on you?" he said, in a context that has nothing to do with the estate records. She thought of all the reasons this was impractical, and then she thought of how she had sat in the kitchen for a morning, waiting for a footman's knock, and what she had been waiting for, and whether she had known what she was waiting for, and she decided that she had. "Yes," she said. "My lord." "Marcus," he said. "That will take some practice," she said. Something happened in his face then. It was not a smile. Not quite. But it was what lived in the place where a smile might be permitted in a man who had been careful for a very long time. He withdrew his hand from the shelf. He stepped back. Proper distance restored, the cold archive air settling back into the space between them. He looked at her once more, and then he looked at the volume on the shelf. He reached up, not for the registration volume, but for a different one, the property survey from 1801 that she had been copying the night he had found her here. He turned it over in his hands, and he looked at the notation on the spine in her father's handwriting. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his coat. He held the miniature for a moment in his palm, the small oval case, the ivory face behind the glass, barely visible in the candlelight. His mother, who had been careful about documentation, who had kept her own copies of the things that mattered, who had been lawfully married in the spring of 1784, and had never lived to know that someone would try, a generation later, to make it otherwise. He did not speak. He opened the case and looked at the miniature for a long time, and Cecily stood beside him and did not look away. He closed the case. He put it back in his breast pocket. "Thank you," he said. The words were not about the archive. She walked home as the first snow of December began to fall, the light kind of snow that does not settle, but drifts, so that the whole world outside the lodging-house window looked soft and uncertain, and full of something beginning. Judith was at the window when she came in, watching the snow, and she looked at Cecily's face and smiled the knowing smile of a younger sister who has been waiting to be right about something for a very long time. Cecily hung her coat. She sat at the kitchen table. She opened her document case, empty now of its hidden thing, and she ran her fingers along the lining where the forgery had been folded all those weeks, and then she closed the case and left it in its corner. The fire was warm. Outside, the snow fell. She thought of her father at his table in the archive, setting her down with a pen in her hand when she was 8 years old, and telling her to look at what was actually on the page. She had looked. She had kept looking until she found it. Some things, her father had said, are worth the trouble of finding. She had believed him then. She believed him still.